First of all, I want to say a massive thank you. I think, first of all, thank you to everybody who's here at the end of the day. Somebody said the slot after lunch is the tiring one when people think, oh, what a lovely dinner. But the one I have now, or we have, is, I wonder what we're going to get for our dinner now this evening or at drinks. So thank you for paying attention. I particularly want to say a massive thank you to the conference organisers because they have been so effective in coordinating this. And apart from Keith, Naomi, Margaret, in particular, Chris is just a dream. If you ever want a job in Brighton, Chris, call me up because we'd love to have you. And also, I want to thank the audience, not just for being here, but the people I've managed to talk to so far. It's extremely refreshing to come here and talk and engage with people who are really actively involved in implementing policies to try and address some of these problems. And it's the enthusiasm and the attitude we can do something that is incredibly refreshing, given that I come from a country that sort of suffers from a tendency to self-depreciation, and at the moment we have a rather heavy dose of cynicism for a variety of reasons. So it's brilliant to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. Right, I'm actually going to put my timer on now. Right. Well, I was honest, wasn't I? Right, I have to work out how this goes. Okay, briefly, what I'm going to do is talk about this new book that came out in June. There is a little flyer on the table where you can get a reduction. I don't get any money out of it. If you want a free copy, it's also available on the internet. Anyway, off we go. Right, what I'm briefly going to do in this 20 minutes is talk about what can we learn from the past. Keith and Janet and ourselves, we discussed what I should do, so I was kind of given a script and told what to do. So after yesterday's discussion, I thought, well, I'll change it a bit, because I think that's the leitmotif, isn't it, of this whole disruptive age. So I thought I'd try and answer some of the questions we asked yesterday of what can we learn from the past, who are the key actors, what are the key issues, what can we learn from other countries, and how is Canada shaping up. So apart from preparing myself for my first visit to Ontario by watching a couple of episodes of Cardinal, and putting on my K.D. Lang tunes of cigarettes and coffee, or whatever their album's called. I forgot, my dad bought it for me a long time ago. I get in the mood of the groove of what the cultural references here are. I thought, apart from the fact I actually do quantitative research, on my way from downtown, or wherever it is called, your train station, to central Kingston, I was taken by a very interesting taxi driver. Now, this won't count as ethnographic anthropological research. And he said, oh, what do you do? How are you here? And he was kind of had very, very long hair, filthy, dirty taxi. But anyway. And he said, I said, we'll work on employment. You know, things like Uber. Oh, right, let me tell you a thing or two about Uber. And what I want to do is illustrate, my taxi driver, Jeffrey, informed me of some of the big issues you're facing around Uber, and it illustrates a number of interesting points that are relevant to some of the things I'm going to say. As you will know, Uber in Kingston is currently experiencing the introduction of new bylaws to regulate Uber so that it has signs on the cars, there are safety checks, there are no cars over 7 years old, there's a licensing fee, drivers have to be registered, criminally checked, they have to have goods and services tax applied to the delivery, and there are very, very different politics between Kingston and Toronto, even though they're in the same province. So this raises a whole load of interesting questions. One, why are there those differences? There's a history of the way taxi firms are regulated in this area compared to Toronto, and why there's a different politics happening. And this little picture I got out of the internet is the drivers in Toronto protesting about the fact that the Toronto are not quite as effective as the people in Kingston in implementing this new regulation. To be discussed. You tell me more what's going on. Anyway, it's interesting because it illustrates how regulation is not just something that happens from the top down, the government change it. But one of the themes I want to bring out in this talk is who are the actors bringing about change? Now, my driver, Jeffrey, clearly thought he was one of those actors. And I think it raises a lot of really interesting questions about who are the people who are involved in bringing about change. It's not just Amazon and these big platforms doing it their way. It's not even governments competing to bring down forms of regulation to compete for these firms. It's also about how workers are organising on new ways and new platforms to contest the way some of these things have been implemented and how they should comply with it. And this level of contestation and action really varies, not just by country, as I'm going to show you, but also, as you can see, even within Ontario. Okay, that's the message. If you want a little sleep now, you can have a little sleep, because then you'll say, oh, I remember what she said. Right, okay, now I'm actually going to talk about the question I asked yesterday. What can we learn from past revolutions, like past industrial revolutions? Well, they were pretty ugly, pretty brutal, and sometimes very, very fast. We only have to think of some of the pictures we see of the Industrial Revolution in Manchester and Birmingham from the 18th century, of people living in utterly dire poverty, overcrowding, lack of sanitation. We also saw there was a massive displacement in those earlier industrial revolutions of people moving from the countryside into the cities. Today, it might not be quite so ugly and brutal, to be decided, but we do see in some countries a massive movement of people. So there's 275 million Chinese have left the countryside in the past 10 years in China and moved into the cities. It's the equivalent of possibly the entire population of the United States moving to Europe. Ugh, what a nightmare. But it just gives you a sense of how big it is. We've also seen, as many of you will know, if you pop over to England and buy a cup of coffee from Starbucks, you're most likely to be served from somebody from Portugal or Spain, or go to Sports Direct. It's full of people. From young people have been moving to Germany, the UK and Ireland to get jobs because there are no jobs in Southern Europe. So we do see some of the consequences of austerity since the past 10 years are associated with some of the things that are happening here in terms of what we learned from the past and what's happening today. Maybe not quite on the same scale, it depends what country you're in. Ugly, brutal, and sometimes very fast. What did we learn from past revolutions? It depends on where you live. If you lived in England in the 18th and 19th century, it went very, very fast. The first industrialised country. If you're in France, ça va un peu plus lentement, for various reasons, because the structure of the French economy didn't adopt industrialisation to the same speed. In Germany, it went much, much slower. You have a decentralisation in villages and places like that. And the role of those associations in those regional areas were very different to the impact where it happened in big cities very brutally. And you see that today in terms of digitalisation. There are going to be some fast movers at the top, and there are going to be some people who are so far behind what's going to happen to them. It also entailed, and I think it's really important to say, conflict. One of the issues we raised yesterday's discussion was social policy. Did that come about because people thought, oh, it's so nice to be nice to people? Well, usually, yeah, it is a nice idea, but if it costs you something, people are thinking, oh, yeah, it will hurt my purse a bit too much, so maybe I won't bother. So organisations, employers, governments only do things when they actually really have to. And they only have to because they're contested or conflict is there to say, we need to say who is legitimate to be covered by this social protection, etc. There's a long history of it. So will we also see new forms of social conflict? Some of it we're seeing through litigation in the courts with Deliveroo and Uber, etc. But this is part of the story, so let's take it for what it's going to be there, because nobody's actually mentioned it at the time. And the other thing I think we also need to say is there are several things, contradictory things happening at the same time. So while the sky is falling in for some, chicken licking, on the other hand, for others, it's creating a lovely new big blue space to think about new big ideas. And as in the Victorian era, while you saw dire poverty alongside some flourishing of the arts and creativity. And I think maybe the contemporary era also reflects those contradictory tendencies, and that's why nobody can quite agree on what is actually happening. Is it good? Is it bad? Or is it's all happening at the same time? Right, rock on, because I've only got a little time left. Who are the key actors of change in the past? New industrialists, liberal thinkers and humanists who wanted to reform the appalling working conditions they saw around them. Trade unions, so important, and of course political parties that stood and created new parties to come into government to implement some of these changes. Let's remember those and think about those when we get to the end of it. Right, on to the main bit. The book, briefly, is in two parts. The first part looks at debates around the Fourth Industrial Revolution. It looks at how the destructive creation of employment the changing face of work in the digital age. Who are digital workers? How do they vary in terms of ethnicity, gender, and location? It looks at how labour relations have been challenged in the welfare state. There are loads of great chapters in there. They're specifically designed to be readable, so they're 5,000 words-ish. So hopefully you can get your teeth into that as a bit of holiday reading for what's left. And the second part of the book is 21 case studies. Fortuitously, we included Canada. I must have known that Keith was going to phone me up and say, would you like to come to Canada? I said, oh, yeah, I just happen to have a Canada chapter in my new book. But it also shows you that Canada is on the map in terms of what's going on. And what I think is quite interesting about this book, if I say it myself, one was interesting is, first of all, nobody else had got a book with that title in it, which is, if you go to Amazon and check out your title, why has nobody else written a book with that? McKinsey wrote one report. So there's there are stacks of books like that on Amazon. You've got one there. But why is nobody talking exactly about work? They're talking about all these different dimensions of it, but there's very little on that. And the second thing that's interesting, nobody is comparing what's happening in different countries. It's all a big whoosh tsunami that's coming over all of us, all at the same time. And there's no real differentiation between what's happening in different countries, different regions, different sectors, to different groups of workers. Okay, we had some of it here, but it's like it's something that is ubiquitous. And really, we really do need to differentiate between what's happening to the countries. Right, briefly, because I've only got 10 minutes left, arguments meant by yesterday by Gabriella, what we've seen in terms of the change is the role of intangible investments. I'm going to run through these quickly because you can pick them up if you want them later, but I want to get on to the international comparison bits at the end. Okay, intangibles have become a key driver in terms of GDP growth in some countries. This is because, as Gabriella talked about very eloquently yesterday, there are lower costs of production and services, the powerful use of data, there's scalability, spillovers and synergies, all the jargon that comes with these debates. There are the disadvantages of winner-takes-all dynamics in the market and a power shift from labour to capital and through these new large platforms that everybody's talking about. I'm not going to go on about that because there's a lot written and I've got not too much time. The key themes explored in the book are how it's disrupting labour, how it's creating value, what are platforms like, how it's affecting regulation, skills education, tax and social policy, which you've had lots of people talk about it today. That's where you can go to get the link to the PDF for free. And what I want to do now, briefly, I'm sure you're sick to death of having a graph, but I'm terribly sorry. I have a few favourite graphs in my life. Makes me a sad person. But anyway, these are one or two of them. What I want to do here briefly is to look at how do we compare different societies and what the European Union is doing. And also at the end of this, I'm going to show you where Canada sits in relation to this. Now, there isn't actually a massive amount of work being done on this, but the European Union has been collecting this for a number of years. And one of the things that's interesting is, in terms of comparative research, there is a lot of work going into creating benchmarks on where is the best city to live. Answer, number 3, who was reading the news? It's Toronto. Right, we know that a lot of this international research compares where the better lives. These things actually matter in terms of, politically, you could say Toronto will sell itself as this is a really cool place to live. Countries that are behind say, what do we need to do to bring ourselves up to that benchmark? With this indicator, what the European Union does is take 5 measures. 1 is connectivity, so what does the infrastructure look like? 2, human capital, I'll explain how that's measured in a minute. 3, there's a measure on how citizens use the internet. 4, how much does business take up digital technologies? This is a theme that was mentioned in earlier sessions today, and this is one that's really, really neglected and in need of attention, if I may say as an aside, because a lot of the discussion is about the problem is a supply-side problem. Its labour needs to make itself more employable, more skillful, etc., and that's where the problem lies. But actually, the real problem lies is with firms. Firms are not able, for various reasons, to adopt these technologies to employ the people that have got the skills. That's where you can see some of it. And the 5th dimension is public sector and how it's been implemented in government. Right, just a quick quiz to keep you, see if you're still awake. Which countries in the European Union do you think are in the top 4? This is like a pub quiz, you know, you get a point if you put your hand up. Pardon? Estonia. 1 point over there. Sweden, yep. Netherlands, Ireland, Denmark, Finland. Oh, you've obviously read all the book, fantastic. What about Germany? Why did nobody mention Germany? My colleagues were not happy because they're German. Right, this graph basically shows you, sorry about it, it's a bit of a horrible, I'm sick to death of looking at it. The short version is the top 4 countries that score highly on all 5 dimensions, Denmark, Sweden, Finland and the Netherlands. The middle bars outlined there is Germany, just slightly above the EU average. Max was not happy. He said the indicator must be wrong because Spain and Estonia were higher than him, including the UK and Ireland. Now, this is interesting. I have to put this aside. One thing, as a kind of academic who does comparative political economy, we are told that coordinated capitalism, like Germany, is much more effective than liberal models. But we see here the social democratic Scandinavians in small, relatively homogenous countries seem to be at the forefront, followed by the Brits and Ireland, again, liberal democracies, and the Germans and the French are finding this transition much, much more difficult. And the question is, why? Well, some people say it's because they're French, but other people would not. Now, let's break down this skill index, right? Let's look only at skills. So this only takes the dimension that looks at, first of all, what the blue bar represents. What are the basic skills? So people who report that they can use a computer and word processing or email or something like that. It tells you what percentage of the population answering those surveys so they can do that. And the red bar represents the percentage of people in the labour market who have STEM skills. What do we see here? I'm going to focus on the UK because that's where I come from at the moment. Finland, Netherlands, Sweden. Britain's in there at number 4. Okay, we don't even get a bronze medal, but we're in the top 4 in terms of people in the labour market who identify having digital skills in terms of these measures. Germany and Ireland are a bit further down, and France and Belgium are also just above the EU average. And as you can see, there are countries right down at the back who are real complete laggards in terms of what's happening there. Now, this is where I come to the point I made about the role of business. If you look on this measure in terms of how businesses are using digital technologies, and this measures business digitalization, which measures things like, do you use customer relations management software? Do you use e-processing formats or e-recruitment? The blue bar measures e-commerce, so do you trade over the internet? The top 3 countries are Denmark, Finland, and Ireland, are the countries here. Germany is further down the line, UK is below the EU average, and France is also below it. Now, what does that very simple measure tell us? It tells me that in the UK, British firms are not adopting digital technologies as extensively as, for example, in Ireland or some of the other countries, although we have a population who says that they are digitally literate, and we have a high proportion of STEM graduates in the labour market. Now, that to me is a really missing point, that we need to actually engage employers in discussing what some of these trends are. E-government, are we nearly there yet? Top players here are Finland, Estonia, champion of e-government, Denmark and Spain. Very, very interesting about why is it that these countries have been able to implement a digitalization which measures things like how accessible are public services through digital technology, whether that's getting your car licensing and tax forms online, etc. How many of those services can you do? And those countries are right up at the top there. The UK, France and Belgium are in the middle, and my good old colleagues over there from Germany, which I used to work and I have great affection for, are right down far at the bottom. Now, why is that happening? Is it because they live in a federal system that's more difficult to implement? Is it because there's a kind of Datenschutzangst? People have anxieties about the use of data on the internet? Are these things that are holding back why it's not happening in Germany, but it is happening in Estonia and Spain? These are all fascinating questions. If somebody wants to do a PhD looking at them, very interesting, call me up or talk to Keith and the crew. Right, come back to the key challenges. Very briefly, I know I've got 1 and a bit minutes left. Some of the key challenges. Cécile Joly talks about slow adaptation and the need for multi-level social dialogue. I'm going to run through these quickly. John Seisman and Martin Kenny talk about investments in inequality. There is a real lack in Europe of venture capital to invest in it that's comparable to what's happening in the US. Jill Ruby and Deborah Howcroft talk about gender inequalities and the way these new platforms are reproducing many of these inequalities. Stefano, who's going to talk here, is going to talk more about gig workers, and Miles is also going to talk about some of the issues raised by people like Bruno Palier, who talks about what challenges it presents for the welfare state and why welfare states will behave in very different ways, depending on the coalition of political actors in those institutions. So this asks the question, why are some countries less effective than the forerunners? Very briefly, let's take some of the top forerunners. Denmark. They may all look similar, Scandies. They have a bit of Nordic noir, which I appreciate, along with the Canadian versions. But they're also quite different in terms of how their politics work. So we have the emphasis in Denmark, according to the authors there, is that there's voluntary agreements. It's not about legislation. In Finland, the authors point out that these implementation of these changes brought with them a great deal of social uprise and outrage with it. There was a wage freeze, there was increases in working time, reductions to holiday pay, a transfer of social security costs to employees, and the government said we're going to take the lead on AI. So it came about, eventually, there was a consensus, but that consensus didn't come about easily, even in Finland, although somebody else mentioned the Finnish case here earlier as well. Sweden, okay, they incorporated it within a largely active labour market policy and co-determination. And the Netherlands talk about it in terms of flexibility they have in their particular labour market, and their chapter emphasises very much some of the sectoral differences which got some attention here today but need also addressing. And there's also another chapter about the Netherlands that talks about an intelligent augmentation and how do we have a debate which talks about a robot dividend, however that tax or should be arranged. Okay, it's very briefly. Canada. Let's go back to Canada. I've got actually 1 minute left, another 1 minute on my digital system. Oh, it has a ping. It's because I turned it silent. Have the Canadians got it? Well, actually, in the UK, people think the Canadians are pretty quite cool guys, especially the one running the Bank of England. Gomez and Gomez from Toronto argue the Canadians are there, they're seen as resourceful, they have leadership, there's major enhancements to post-secondary education, physical infrastructure, pensions, unemployment insurance, income support, housing, and universal healthcare, and they've also built apparently 9 new universities. My goodness gracious, what do you guys do? Right, you have a new innovation in superclusters, you have funds to invest in projects that cross-pollinate, and there's it goes on, a whole list of different things in terms of policies that are directed very much about education and wages, blending apprenticeships. You've got world-class education across the spectrum. You have labour and income support policies. You respond to low wage and precarious employment, minimum wages. Dream on, my goodness. How many people in Europe would absolutely just love what's happening here? It's incredible. And it's all there. Support for new tech, first movers. You've got neural network research programs in Toronto as well, powering voice recognition in soft mobile phones. And it goes on like this. But there's no perfect cloud. I know I've gone 2 minutes over, but I have 1 minute generosity I've allowed myself. The dark clouds, which we saw some of them, Keith sort of organised those ominously to prepare the discussions. It couldn't just be sunshine, it had to come with a bit of rain. So what are the concerns some of the Canadians have? Is this basic income, which has now apparently been abolished, a kind of threadbare replacement to the existing welfare state? So although it was abolished by Conservative government, was it a threat anyway? It's not clear if that was a good policy or not. There's an issue that was raised by some other people here as well. There's too much tech-centred focus on the labour market, and it ignores opportunities for meaningful employment in other sectors, i.e. personal services and care-based work, and that has been mentioned by other people here. And it involves innovation across all sectors and occupations, not only the tech sector. You have a mixed blessing of a mixed economy of tech firms. So, as you don't need me to tell you, there's obviously some controversy about the use of Google at Quayside, is how you pronounce it, and who's got access to the data that are collecting there, while at the same time you also have seen as positive support for local startups through Corktown Common. You've got contradictory things going on here at the same time, and they're part of your debate that my taxi driver Jeffrey mentioned. Right, I have got one last page, and this is just to show you where the Canadians sit. I'm terribly sorry. Stall out. Canada is up there in the pink box, sort of towards the yellow box. This is an analysis in the Harvard Business Review to try and plot an index for more than the European Union, and it tries to identify which countries are stand out, they're really making radical progress, so the United Arab Emirates is in there, New Zealand, Singapore, countries that are breaking out, that are just starting off, countries to watch out, things are not going well, and stall out. So you're in the stall out category. So what does that mean? You have done really well, but you need to maintain the momentum of public-private partnerships in digital innovation. You need to look at investments in reskilling workers, which you're clearly aware of. You need to look at access to capital and digital resources and how these can be improved to reduce inequalities. And it looks at keeping pace with the transforming rules of competition, of how these impact the way we collect taxes or impose other costs on employers and workers. And keep a direct investment, not just in the easy-to-win areas, but in areas that are more difficult and address more steeper problems. So to come back to the thing I started up, what do we learn from past revolutions? Ugly, brutal, fast. Displacement, it varies by country. It involves conflict and possible fragmentation at the same time as creativity. And who are the key actors of change where you are? So these are, I thought, sort of North American characters that might identify with. And what I want to also do in my last second is, I know there's a number of people here who have got something to say about who they think the key actors of this change are, because they are part of it, acting it. And I think it'd be really interesting to hear from you, to hear what you've got to say. That's it. Sorry, 3 minutes, 4 minutes too long.